studying Measure for Measure and now you're desperate to get an understanding on how this extraordinary play is shown with a key production. Well, I'm going to take you to the extraordinary world of Bob Komar's 2006 Measure for Measure film. I'm going to go through all 5 acts and show you how you can integrate references to this film within an A-star A-level essay. So stay tuned because you're watching Schofield on Shakespeare.
Although these lines do not appear in Measure for Measure, they are largely Shakespearean and are based on an exchange in Act 3, Scene 1 of Romeo and Juliet between Tybalt and Mercutio, which ultimately leads to Mercutio's death and Romeo getting furious revenge by killing Tybalt. However, the context in this film version of Measure for Measure is far less serious and tense. In this film, these words are spoken in a toilet. In this version, when the Duke comes to the verb blow, he looks irritatingly up at Aeschylus and clearly means that she should blow away and get out and leave him to his sexual pleasures. And so within this production, the Duke is clearly as much a part of the out-of-control sexual excess as anyone else. In Act 3, Scene 2 of Shakespeare's play, when Lucio declares mischievously that the Duke would have paid for the nursing 1,000, he had some feeling of the sport, and would put a ducat in a beggar of 50's clack dish, implying that he paid for sex, there is plenty of doubt as to whether this is true. Considerably less doubt in this production. Here the Duke is clearly unfit to lead, as well as needing some uncomfortable persuasion to forego his sexual pleasures in order to attend to official business. He is seen taking cocaine. And what of the business that Aeschylus wants the Duke to attend to? What can be so important that it can mean he has to be dragged out of some toilet? Well, outside it is carnage. Soldiers are shown burning the Union Jack, laughing manically. This is clearly a place out of control, and this man clearly has no idea what to do. How can a druggie, willing to partake in casual sex in a toilet with his subordinates close by, be the man who will restore law and order? So perhaps Claudio does need to be publicly humiliated and shown thus to the world, to send a message to the general population that sexual excess will no longer be tolerated and will be punished. Within this world, Angelo has to take a stand. And even if Claudio is a little unlucky to be the person targeted for his clampdown, publicly dousing his bruised face with freezing cold water may lead to the beginning of a much healthier, more ordered, happier, cleansed society. Indeed, this director emphasizes Angelo's initial good intentions by adding a section in which he goes into the chapel to ask for confession. And you can probably guess who he ends up confessing to. The Duke, who in his disguise has donned a shaggy black wig and sunglasses to indicate, quite appropriately, blindness. He is the slightly stooping figure on the left in this screenshot. In the dialogue, once again, we see the insertion of lines from another Shakespeare play, this time All's Well That Ends Well. Friar Thomas says light-heartedly to the Duke that the soul of this man is his clothes, presumably referring to Angelo being so strict and severe that his smart, tight-fitting military uniform reflects his inner austerity. Nonetheless, Angelo seems utterly genuine in this scene, and at this point in the film clearly wants to do the right thing and take the necessary harsh measures to clean up the community. This addition means that the Duke's claim in Act 3, Scene 1 of Shakespeare's play that he is confessor to Angelo is literally true, rather than a glib means of trying to reassure a panicking Isabella that Angelo is merely making an essay of her virtue. In this production, this drug-snorting, pill-popping, sex addict of a Duke must, over here, be closely involved in all intrigue from all parties. After all, this way he can watch others cleaning up the mess that he has allowed to grow and satisfy his own idle curiosities about his number two. This exam question requires candidates to probe the idea that measure is a play in which power is invariably misused. Here's a paragraph mulling over this question, referencing the Bob Komar production. It is important to reference Angelo's good intentions when unexpectedly given control of Vienna early on in the play. Modern audiences may groan at the idea of a man being imprisoned and threatened with death just for having sex, yet Claudio himself recognizes that he has committed an offence and that to some extent his punishment is just. In Kumar's 2006 production, we see Claudio being publicly humiliated in front of his fellow soldiers. He is doused in freezing cold water whilst bare-chested, with other soldiers looking on and laughing. Such humiliation has been ordered by Angelo, but given that the beginning of the film has shown drug-taking, flag-burning and sexual cavorting in a toilet, the viewer is likely to feel that making an example of someone is necessary, and that Angelo may be using his new power prudently in order to send a strong message to the rest of the community that from this point onwards sexual excess will be punished. Indeed, the director of this production emphasizes Angelo's desire to use his power sensibly and morally by adding a scene in which he visits the chapel to ask for confession. So Angelo's early presentation shows at least a desire to use his power justly, even if his choice of a person to make an example of is questionable. Claudio is already engaged to Juliet and fast his wife. And it's important to reference a change to the sequence of scenes within this production. The first part of Act 2, Scene 1, in which Angelo gives his views on the importance of the law being upheld consistently and firmly to Aeschylus, appears immediately after the end of Act 1, Scene 1. In the original, of course, we move from the Duke's transfer of power in Act 1, Scene 1 to Act 1, Scene 2, in which Lucio and two other gentlemen speculate about the Duke and joke amongst each other before the respective entries of Mistress Overdone, Pompey, and Claudio himself. Thus, the mood is far more light-hearted, and the spotlight is not on Angelo to anywhere near the same extent. Indeed, the first time he is indirectly mentioned in Act 1, Scene 2 is in line 57, with the revelation that Claudio has been arrested and carried to prison. So, in this Komar production, the spotlight beams on Angelo earlier, and he comes across as even more dogmatic and unyieldingly dictatorial in this version of Act 2, Scene 1, partly due to Aeschylus's lines being cut. You can see how this scene has been butchered, with Aeschylus' scripts of all, in this production, her lines, including her plea for Angelo to take a more moderate approach. Additionally, the director chooses to use a voiceover at certain points and shows Angelo's crackdown taking place. Here we can see Juliet being unceremoniously and brutally seized, and Claudio here. And whilst we remember the chaos and carnage of the early part of the film, which included cocaine sniffing, sexual activity within toilets and flag burning, the savage way Claudio and Juliet are arrested does seem over the top and harsh, especially given the fact that the Duke himself equally partook in such activities. Angelo seems rather too pompous and self-righteous for our liking, as the camera pans between distressing images of heavy handling and oh so calm smugness. This aloof-seeming arrogance continues when Isabella first arrives to speak to him. He fails to offer her the simple courtesy of turning around or looking at her whilst asking what is her will. And he is still not turned to face her when he challenges the admittedly ludicrously illogical suggestion that he might condemn the fault and not the actor of it. So what should we make of this behaviour, this failure to follow basic rules of courtesy or social behaviour? Might this Angelo be on the autistic spectrum and struggle with basic eye contact, the rules of social communication? Or might he be someone who has had, Mariana accepted, very little contact with women and so find direct dealings with them uncomfortable? Or might he understand in his darkest, deepest soul just how tempting and attractive women can be, resulting in him choosing to limit his dealings with them to the bare minimum. In my mind, this persistent looking away from Isabella works well and hints at repressed feelings and emotions which will come to the surface following sustained dealings with this fair maid. As indeed happens in Act 2 Scene 4, when he is so outraged at Isabella's cheek in suggesting that she will tell the world aloud what man thou art, that he pins her down on his desk and holds her there by the wrists. His grip tightens as the speech goes on, with the spread legs position of Isabella having obvious violent sexual overtones. What we're seeing clearly in this production is that Angelo the man is significantly stronger than Isabella. Not only is she disadvantaged by the power imbalance, but also by the fact that Angelo may be prepared to overpower her physically in order to satisfy his uncontrollable desires and urges. So, to what extent do we feel that the women in the play are dominated by the men? Isabella's two exchanges with Angelo in Act 2 are significant in relation to the question as to whether the women in the play are dominated by the men. It is true that she takes a while to warm to her task and needs some prompting from Jack-in-the-Box Lucio in the original text, although not in Kumar's 2006 production, in which Lucio's character barely features, and she herself takes the decision to try Angelo again. However, once she gets into her stride, the way she dominates the exchange and comes up with passionate, compelling reasons for Angelo to save her brother's life is impressive. Ultimately, Angelo cannot cope with her verbal bombardment and her persistent use of rhetorical devices, including dizzying use of anaphora early on in Act 2, Scene 2, for which I would not plead, for which I must not plead. Perspective challenging anti-metaboly, if he had been as you and you as he, and broad-ranging imagery, which includes references to figures as diverse as an ape, Jove, and new-made man. Unfortunately, this ability to dazzle verbally is of comparatively little worth in a society in which the Duke or his chosen deputy seems to have ultimate power if he chooses to use it. Furthermore, a number of productions show men choosing to capitalize on superior physical strength as well as institutionalized power in order to intimidate and dominate women. For instance, in Kumar's 2006 production, Isabella's fabulous oratory ultimately results in Angelo pinning her to his desk, clearly sexually aroused and furious at her non-compliance. The early moments of Act 3 in this production accentuate the natural sympathy we feel for Claudio. Why the hell should a man be sentenced to death simply for sleeping with a woman he is effectively already married to? Within the screenshot, you can just about make out a truncheon mid-air in the top left-hand corner, which is about to be brought down upon Claudio, a brutal beating which is clearly making the provost uncomfortable. The evidence of Claudio's brutal treatment in prison is there for all, and Isabella, to see during their exchange in Act 3, Scene 1. Blood seeps from his nose and ear. There is a large purple bruise on his left cheek. As well as heightening the sympathy and compassion we feel for Claudio, these facial wounds are likely to make our minds return to Angelo and the proportionality of his so-called law enforcement. Now Claudio is in prison and by all accounts and purposes is set to die. Is there any real need for Angelo to have him treated so appallingly? This moment from Act 1, Scene 2 sends a public message and thus serves a purpose. Does this? And so the viewers become more likely to gloss over the cocaine sniffing and attempted shagging from the opening of the film and instead wonder about this Angelo-led regime. Indeed, given that the Duke and Friar Thomas seem to develop a genuine bond. In Act 1, Scene 3, they share a light-hearted joke about Angelo when Friar Thomas suggests that the soul of Angelo is his clothes. And here, at the end of Act 3, Scene 2, the Duke's soliloquy about the importance of rulers being honourable and holy at the end of Act 3, Scene 2 is delivered, with him standing closely by a stern-looking Friar Thomas. We are likely to feel strongly that the Duke may be the more principled and caring leader, and the sooner he is back to lead Vienna, the better. Indeed, in this production, he does less slightly disconcerting snooping and sneaking around, less dark corners stuff, if you like. Line 52 from Act 3, Scene 1, in which the Duke asks the Provost to bring him to hear Claudio and Isabella speak, is cut, and instead the Duke overhears because he previously telephoned Claudio in the prison to counsel him to be absolute for death, and Claudio left the phone off the hook when Isabella entered. This changes the dynamics. By leaving the phone off the hook deliberately or otherwise, Claudio is implicitly suggesting that he has no objection to the Duke overhearing what is likely to be an intimate, emotionally charged meeting with his sister, and by extension, he trusts him. That said, when Isabella leaves Claudio during an increasingly fraught exchange, and Claudio picks the phone up again to presumably beseech the Most Holy Father for comfort and advice, the Duke looks slightly panic-stricken before hanging up without saying anything. Presumably, as in Shakespeare's original text, his priority is to advise Isabella, who at least has some agency over the future in a way which Claudio does not. The time for Claudio's comfort and salvation will come. Other moments of interest in this production include Isabella slapping Claudio, as she points out that his sleeping with Isabella didn't happen by chance, but was a habitual practice. Something useful perhaps to reference in a question about passivity, lack of agency of women. And the production, as a movie rather than something filmed live on a stage, is also able to show flashbacks of Angelo and Mariana as the Duke explains his extravagant plan, both when they were a happy couple, albeit with Mariana seeming slightly keener on the snog than Angelo, and following Angelo's abandonment. Of course, the effect of these flashbacks is to remove some of the focus away from the Duke and to show categorically that his plan is far from the fanciful, overly convenient lot of nonsense that we might initially conclude in the theatre. Instead, the Duke coming up with this plan immediately paints him as a compassionate, caring, keen for justice person. And that's even before meeting Mariana live in the film. Indeed, the film doesn't just show flashbacks, but also how a successful Mariana Angelo late night liaison worked, with Mariana placing a blindfold over a throbbing Angelo within a silent, darkened room. These flashbacks, successful envisagings, flash forwards, suggest straight away that the Duke has come up with a clever, practical, compassionate plan aimed at resolving a number of complex situations. Indeed, given the emphasis on the tragic loneliness of Mariana, one could even argue that it would be wrong for the Duke to reveal himself to Angelo at this point. Such a revelation might well save Isabella's chastity and Claudio's life, but would arguably do little to improve the lot of a destitute, cruelly abandoned woman. Time for another sample paragraph, this time on the question as to whether this is a play in which power is invariably misused, and I reference the 2006 Komar production. When exploring this question, it is important to point out just how much power the Duke actually has for the majority of the play. Firstly, he is the Duke, a figure with seemingly absolute authority in Vienna, if he can be bothered to use it. Secondly, when disguised as a friar, he can both gain admittance into prisons and elicit personal confessions from all members of society, notwithstanding the fact that at any time he chooses to do so, he can regain his previous ducal authority. He can also use his disguise to find out how his own character of the Duke is viewed, and use this information to consolidate his power later on, something he is particularly determined to do with Lucio. Modern audiences are likely to feel more uncomfortable with the amount of power the Duke has. But does he misuse it? Putting to one side his marriage proposal to Isabella for the moment, it can be argued that his use of power in much of the play is benign and has compassionate aims. His transfer of power to Angelo shows his recognition that Vienna needs to be cleaned up, and there is some humility in his acceptance that his deputy may be able to do this more effectively. 'Twas my fault to give the people scope. Even more pertinently, His plan to save Isabella's chastity is ingenious in that it not only preserves Isabella's virginity, but redresses an old wrong, namely Angelo's abandonment of a woman who truly loved him, following the desperately unlucky loss of her dowry at sea. Komar's 2006 film of the play highlights the Duke's benevolent use of his power and disguise by cutting to flashbacks of a lonely Mariana, including an extreme close-up of her tragic, sad eyes. The greater emphasis on Mariana in this production suggests to the audience that the Duke is not playing around with far-fetched schemes, is not hell-bent on unnecessarily prolonging his own disguise, but is thinking intelligently about how to rectify complex, potentially tragic situations. Out of all the acts in the play, Act 4 probably contains the most number of cuts. Act 4 Scene 1 is cut entirely, partly because Mariana's acquiescence and participation in the bed swap plot has already been shown by flash forwards during the Duke's exchange and introduction of the plan in Act 3 Scene 1. In Act 4 Scene 2 there is no exchange between Pompey and a Porson or any mentioning of Barnardine. Act 4 Scenes 4 to 6 are cut entirely, and a bit of Act 4 Scene 3 is tagged within a section of Act 4 Scene 2. Here's how the screenplay looks for Act 4 in full. Press pause if you would like to read any of this in more detail. If watching in the classroom, you might want to analyse further the effect of any of the missing sections. The video will move within 5-second intervals between each slide. It is surely this line which is the most unsatisfactory within this version of Act 4. The Provost, having come up with the idea of substituting Claudio's head for Ragazine's, then suddenly and utterly unconvincingly gets cold feet and says that actually doing this would be against his oath. As you can tell from the annotations, the screenwriter has shifted from the happy death of Ragazine in Act 4 Scene 3 back to Act 4 Scene 2, when the Provost has still to be convinced that he should go against Angelo's instructions on the say-so of a mere friar. The trouble with this is that it seems bizarre that the Provost, having talked so eloquently of using Ragazine's head, then changes tack immediately and contradicts himself. That said, it does facilitate the disguised friar having to admit that he is actually much closer to the Duke than what might first appear, and it also reduces the Duke's agency. In this version, yes, he comes up with a whole elaborate plan of Mariana taking Isabella's place in Angelo's pitch black bed, but he doesn't come up with the idea of switching heads. Does that make him slightly less of a control freak? Slightly less of a chess master, moving each piece precisely according to his whim? It's also important to note that in this production, the disguised friar goes further than whipping out the hand and seal of the Duke as shown within an official letter. Indeed, he doesn't do this at all. First, he dismissively screws up Angelo's instructions confirming that Claudio should be executed by 4 of the clock, before removing his blind man's sunglasses to show his eyes and real identity to the Provost. The Provost is so relieved and delighted that he gives the come-home Duke a hug in respectful joy and adoration. All hail the returning, all-conquering hero, even though he never actually went away. And even though some of his pastimes would not be called particularly savoury. The fact that the Duke does categorically reveal his identity early in this production makes him seem more human, especially given the Provost's reaction, and less theatrical. In the original text, it seems as though he wants to control everything and wants to pick the exact moment both of his unveiling and his revelations about Claudio being alive. But here, the fact that he is happy to privately unveil himself to a panting provost, and the fact that his lines containing a feeble excuse about keeping Isabella ignorant of her good to make her heavenly comforts of despair are cut, makes him seem more relatable, more understandable, and less of a megalomaniac. Time for another one of my sample paragraphs, this time on the question as to whether the few good characters shine out in a dark, corrupt world. It is tempting to disagree wholeheartedly with both sides of this provocative statement. Firstly, is it really true to say that there are only a few good characters? In addition to the fairly straightforwardly decent Aeschylus, applies the law humanely, Claudio genuinely loves Juliet, and Mariana, harmless as a fly, other characters also display regular selfless kindness. For instance, Lucio, in spite of his love of wisecracks and sexual innuendo, clearly feels genuine pity for Claudio. He would be sorry his life should be thus foolishly lost at a game of tic-tac. And he also plays a pivotal role in encouraging Isabella to be more passionate when pleading to Angelo for his life. Isabella may shock and surprise with the vehemence of her reaction following Claudio's suggestion that she might sleep with Angelo, but she always tries to do the right thing and openly declares that she would throw down her life, but not her chastity, for Claudio as frankly as a pin. And then there is Angelo and the Duke. Yes, Angelo is dark and corrupt in his attempts to get Isabella to yield her body to his will, but as Isabella herself points out, a due sincerity governed his deeds till he did look on me. As for the Duke, he is genuinely shocked by Angelo's hypocrisy and works tirelessly to help Isabella preserve her chastity, albeit whilst continually delaying revealing his identity, which many audience members might have felt the more logical, straightforward means of resolving the situation. Of course, the extent to which we feel Vienna is a dark, corrupt world, or say, a vibrant, fun place in which sex and jokes are commonplace, will depend on the production. The 2006 Komar film starts by showing widespread anarchy, drug-taking, sex in toilets, and flag burning. Given this production's elimination of the vibrant subplots, the vast majority of Pompey, Lucio, and Elbow's lines are cut, this world initially does seem dark and corrupt. And yet other changes emphasise the good. The Duke, for instance, shows his human side by revealing his identity to the Provost in Act 4, resulting in a heartwarming hug. Firstly, Act 5, Scene 1 starts on a much smaller scale. There is not the same crowd or celebratory air as the 1979 production, or the same elaborate formality as the 2004 Globe version. So this means that the encounters become less about public showing off or public declarations about justice, and more about the dynamics between the characters. To some extent, this may be due to the change in setting. From an entire city of Vienna in Shakespeare's original, at least in theory, in practice it is Shakespeare's London, but with the change in location to prevent accusations of slander, to a British army base. Any judgments and precedents will only impact upon the lives and careers of a relatively small number as opposed to a city or a full society. In addition, looking on from the outside, do many of us not consider army communities to be slightly different anyway? Not just far more regimented, but also with more extremes within relationships, i.e. you might get friends for life, but is there not also the potential for some terrible bullying? Indeed, when we think about the main plot devices of Measure for Measure, how surprising do we feel it would be for a man with authority to try to procure sex in an unsavoury way within the stereotypically macho, intense, claustrophobic confines of an army base? Other moments of interest in this production include some rather creepy stroking of Isabella's face by the Duke, as he both simultaneously suggests that Isabella must be mad, but nonetheless seems to be talking with some logical reasoning. As ever with this production, there are hints of unnecessary displays of violence. Here we see a guard branding a baton towards Isabella's neck following the Duke's abrupt, and curious in any production, demand for her to be carted off to prison. To my mind, the use of unnecessary violence by guards and officers in the film as a whole seems to point to a kind of desperate paranoia in relation to control. The army base has been in such a state of disorder that excessive violence for the few disciplined for their crimes may be employed as a pathetic, impotent attempt to send a message to the majority. However, there are some strange moments in the final act of this production, partly due to the fact that so much of the play has been cut, and here the role of Aeschylus enormously watered down. It is Angelo, not Aeschylus, who gets in a rage with Friar Lodowick, following his suggestion that the Duke was unjust to reject Isabella and Mariana's appeals for justice, and put the accused person, i.e. Angelo, in charge of judging his own case. So it seems as though Angelo is referring to himself in the third person as this worthy man, which doesn't quite work. However, this change does ensure that the focus remains unequivocally on Angelo as the villain, Angelo as the bad guy. Indeed, given Aeschylus has said so little in the film so far, it would be strange to have him, or her in this production, suddenly getting enraged and commanding here. One change I rather like, however, is the method by which the Duke's real identity is exposed. When changing to his disguise as Friar Lodowick moments previously, the Duke decided to keep on his ring, perhaps a signet ring, or at least a ring signifying his ducal authority. Whilst furiously ordering for Friar Lodowick to be sent to prison, Angelo suddenly spots the friar's hand, and it dawns on him that this man must be the Duke, causing his breathing to quicken and for him to fall to the floor. Thus there is no unseemly grappling as in other productions and arguably the original text. Instead, the Duke calmly removes his blind man's sunglasses, and the Provost, his confirmed ally from Act 4, remember, when the Duke revealed his true identity to him, helpfully takes off his wig. The result of this change is a far smoother, more dignified transition to power for the Duke. There is no need for jaunty whipping off monks' robes to reveal inner finery. Indeed, it is notable that the Duke keeps on his Friar Lodowick dog collar for the remainder of the play. And here, as he demands whether Angelo may have some kind of possible defence for what has happened, knowing that he doesn't. The effect of this is to give the Duke additional gravitas. Helpful perhaps, given his past history. And emphasises the Jacobean view, which was that Duke or King would have been a Christian figure, someone expected to uphold Christian values such as virtue, honour and grace. I'm not so sure that all contemporary audience members would have necessarily believed in the divine right of kings. However, they would have accepted him as head of the church and state, with responsibility for the spiritual well-being of his people. And so in this production, the Duke retaining his dog collar ensures that he comes closer to the broader definition of a duke or a king, i.e. there is a spiritual and religious component, as well as a practical leadership role, than would typically be expected from the head of an army unit. But what are the moments you have all been waiting for? How does Isabella respond to the Duke's marriage proposals? Well, what is notable here is the rough way the Duke first grabs Isabella's arm to show her the returned Claudio, and then continues to hold on to it to ask whether she will give him her hand and she will be his. Unsurprisingly enough, she brushes him off in irritation, doesn't take any notice of his nonsense, and goes up to emotionally embrace Claudio. And the second proposal, in which the Duke declares that what's mine is yours and what is yours is mine. Well, Isabella gives Claudio a final kiss before walking purposefully off into the distance. She may not speak, but the message is unequivocal. There is no way on earth she would be marrying this devious, manipulative, sly prick, whatever his position and authority. Cue tense faces, tense music. Even Mariana looks incredibly miserable, in spite of the fact that she is now married to the man of her dreams. Even more pertinently, the directors cut the attempted face-saving final rhyming couplet of the play, meaning that the play ends categorically with the Duke's isolated failure. No celebratory air, no dancing as at the Globe, just tension. Have the Duke's machinations all been for nothing? Exam question. Is the conclusion of the play, like the play as a whole, full of uncomfortable moral choices? There is no doubt that uncomfortable moral choices abound within the final act of the play. Is the Duke acting morally when he pardons Barnardine, forces Lucio and Angelo to marry Kate Keepdown and Mariana, and himself proposes to Isabella? Barnardine has been described unequivocally as a murderer, not deserving a jot of the provost's pity. Should he really be quit from his past crimes with no further consequences at all? The forced marriages, although logical in their way, also make for slightly uncomfortable viewing, albeit tinged with comedy in some productions. Should a supreme leader be able to publicly impose upon the domestic sphere in this way? With both relationships, one senses that harmonious married life will not be easy to come by, particularly given some of the language used by the men to disparage their now wives. Angelo, presumably outrageously, talked of Mariana's reputation being disvalued in levity, whilst Lucio repeatedly called Kate Keepdown a prostitute and claimed that being married to her would be akin to pressing to death, whipping and hanging. And what of the Duke's proposal to Isabella, the same person he twice referred to as daughter and apparently destined to be a nun? Such a proposal seems, particularly to modern audiences, a gross abuse of power. Not only is he putting implicit pressure on her to accept due to his position as head of state, but he has also managed to worm his way into her affections through his disguise as a friar. As a trainee nun, she would have trusted such a figure unquestionably. In the 2006 Bob Komar production, the Duke even seems to put physical pressure on Isabella to accept his proposal by roughly clinging onto her arm whilst pointing to Claudio's miraculous reappearance as apparent justification for her accepting his offer. The fact that she walks away immediately after the second proposal confirms her feelings of enormous discomfort at what has just occurred.
This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, exploring a key interpretation of the play and giving you moments from all 5 acts and showing you how to weave in references within an A-star A-level essay. Many thanks for watching.